is on net neutrality. Towela. And Pria and Antony. Can you please come forward? The presentation is going to be moderated by Dr. Towela, Jere. Towela works in the Infrastructure Strategic Business Unit at NEPAD Planning and Coordinating Agency, focusing on policy, legal, and regulatory aspects of ICT infrastructure and services. She initiated the NEPAD Internet Governance Program and advocates for increased awareness and participation of African stakeholders in policy and Internet governance processes. Towela, you have the floor. You have 1 hour, Towela. After the presentation, we are going to go for a group photo. So you can do your grooming after the presentation.
Antony, CRASA here, clear. You know where you are coming from.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning.
Good morning.
Just making sure that we're all together. Okay, so our session is on net neutrality and its implications. And I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion. And it will only be as interesting as you make it. Our role here is just to set the tone for the conversation, but we really want this to be an interactive exchange. So to begin with, I think just in terms of why we're having this conversation is that over the last year, and even going back as far as last year with Net Mondial, is that net neutrality has become an issue that has been flagged and highlighted in the internet governance space. The Net Mondial outcome document indicated that there was a need for further discussion on the issue of net neutrality. And then you also know that in February of this year, the FCC in the US made a landmark ruling that prohibited blocking, throttling, and also that there would be no paid prioritization of internet services. In July of 2015, the EU Council and the EU Parliament drafted regulation for a single telecommunications market, which also included provisions about banning paid prioritization, blocking, and throttling. So we felt that against such a backdrop of things that are happening in our global space, that there was a need for us as Africa to also be having this conversation and begin to see whether we actually can have a position or some thoughts and views that would actually lead to a position on net neutrality. And so the purpose of this session is to look at some of the elements of that conversation, just a few questions around the issue of net neutrality and what it really means. And then through that, maybe we'll begin to see if there are some general views around how we should actually approach net neutrality. So I have 3 very good and able panelists supporting me here. My job is very easy because they're all very accomplished experts in their own areas. We have somebody from civil society, we have somebody from private sector, and we have somebody from the regulator. So that should make for interesting conversation. So I think the first thing that I'm going to do is to maybe just introduce the panelists, just so you know who's who. Then I will not have to introduce the panelists as they speak. To my right, I have Pria Chetty, and she's the Regional Director of EndCode. This is an organization based in South Africa. She has over 12 years of experience as a regional technology, legal, and policy advisor, and the clients include multinationals, intergovernmental organizations, startups, and civil society. She has previously worked as the head of PricewaterhouseCoopers Technology Law and Privacy Division. To my immediate left is Mr. Antony Chigaazira, who is the Executive Secretary of CRASA. And CRASA is the Communications Regulatory Association of Southern Africa. He cut his professional teeth as a banker, apparently, over 2 decades ago, before he moved to telecommunications 10 years ago. So we can all figure out how old he is now. He served for several years as a commercial director of the incumbent operator in Zimbabwe before joining CRASA. And he is an active participant in the Southern Africa IGF and the Africa IGF. And to my far left is Dr. Janvier Ngnoulaye. I hope I'm saying that right. And he has served in the board of Afrinic from 2011 to 2014. He is the president of the Cameroon chapter of ISOC since 2011, and he's the technical manager of the National Research and Education Network in Cameroon, as well as being a lecturer in ICT at the University of Yaounde. He is also participating in the Consolidated RI IANA Stewardship Proposal team, what we just heard about just now. And he also is an active participant in ICANN. He has also contributed to the success of the Central Africa IGF, which took place from 23rd to 25th August 2015. So a round of applause for my panelists. So I'm going to start just by asking each of the panelists to give us, in their view, a definition of net neutrality, because that's also one of the challenges we come across, is that there are very different views and definitions in terms of what net neutrality is and what net neutrality is not. So I'm going to start with you, Pria, ladies first, to just give us your opinion in terms of what net neutrality is.
Good morning, everyone. All protocol observed. It's a great pleasure to address you this morning. On the topic of net neutrality, I feel obligated to give us some context that we are speaking about net neutrality in the face of a digital economy where the rules and regulations have largely been very unpredictable and difficult to contain. And that's part of the challenge that sits before us. So I want to preface the definition with some fundamental understanding of the digital economy, which is that it is global, it requires internet access, it requires internet penetration, it is an attention economy, and there's a dependency on being a specific user's preferred content, application, or internet service provider of choice. And as a result of this, there's been a rise in the last few years of very innovative business models. We see new partnerships and new joint ventures to promote access and penetration to the internet and to enable the digital economy in both developed and developing countries. So some of the innovations that we've seen have been, you would have witnessed this in your countries, shaped or unshaped internet packages, where you could have a cheaper option for an internet service where there's a lower quality of service, or you could have an unshaped service which would allow you access to basically any kind of content. What we've also seen is companies like Google innovating by putting YouTube local stores in countries to make access to that particular service easier. And as we saw this, I suppose people started to ask questions as we saw shaped and unshaped services, as we saw local stores of YouTube services. And then what we saw is some kind of subsidization or partial subsidization of internet access costs as part of the internet service or application service or content service. And then more recently, we've seen certain zero-rated services. And as a result of this, I suppose the kind of nervousness around how we're regulating the internet has started to grow. So these innovations have brought certain fundamental questions to the table globally around the state of the internet, its equality, and its neutrality. To quote a very popular definition, net neutrality or network neutrality is the principle that internet service providers and governments and certain other stakeholders should treat all data on the internet equally, not discriminating or charging differentially by user, content, site, platform, application, type of attached equipment, or mode of communication. So where does the problem arise? Why do we need net neutrality in the first place? And now, to quote an organization called Save the Internet, they put it best, summarizing a lot of concerns that we might see on forums and blogs and so on, by suggesting that without net neutrality, cable and phone companies could carve the internet into fast and slow lanes. An ISP could slow down its competitors' content or block political opinions it disagreed with. ISPs could charge extra fees to the few content companies that could afford to pay for preferential treatment, relegating everyone else to a slower tier of service. This would destroy the open internet as we know it. This leads me to introducing just a few implications for our discussion today. When people speak about net neutrality, they're speaking about a few specific topics. Firstly, the need for an open and neutral internet. Secondly, the need for non-discrimination between users and traffic. Thirdly, they speak about the potential harmful effects that we might see on competition, particularly between foreign national service providers that land on our shores and local upcoming startups who would like to enter the market. They also speak about the need for consumer protection. What we want to ensure is quality of services as we see new services coming into the market. We also speak about the freedom of access to content of our choice and how we would protect that freedom. We are looking towards net neutrality to curb any limitations on access to knowledge. We don't want to see companies limiting the knowledge that we need access to, critical knowledge. We also speak about curbing restrictions on free speech. So typically what Towela introduced as blocking or filtering is enabling a way in which we would monitor the type of content that would be released and place restrictions on that, and we don't want that. So what we need is more transparency and accountability. We want to know about the business arrangements. We want to know about the innovative business models. We want to know why there is subsidization or zero rating. Of course, we don't want to have too much surveillance, whether this is at the national level or at specific corporate level. This needs to be contained. And of course, there is a need for data protection. Many of these models are premised on the basis that you would have access to users' data, users' patterns, users' behaviors while using a service, and this access to the data needs to be contained. We'll speak a little bit more about the regulation in the future, but that's, I think, an introduction to the topic.
Thank you, Pria, for that. I'm going to ask Antony to give me your views on how you would actually define or understand net neutrality from a regulator's perspective.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As already defined, net neutrality, I think I needn't even go to the definition because it has been eloquently covered, but just some certain aspects I might add, that it is sometimes referred to as the First Amendment of the Internet. And to the regulators, this is a concept that is very important because this concept came about in the original architecture of Internet that when finally it was coming up, that it had be a principle to be used when it went public, when it was offered to the public, they had to have certain principles. And this is one of the principles which in fact is of interest to regulators because firstly, it gives individual free access to all the content applications equally. So it's free access to all content and applications equally, regardless of source, content, destination, service, terminal, or application. There's no discrimination. And that aspect is critical because regulators have got the mandate to level the playing field, to protect all the players on the corporate landscape in their sector. Anyone can upload anything on the internet. And for regulators, that is a very, very important thing, because it gives the regulators work to do, because then you can set up the policies, you can look at things like child online protection and so on, to make sure at least certain ethics are kept and certain laws are adhered to, and that there is no discrimination. According to net neutrality, there shouldn't be discrimination. All internet data should be treated equally, which is very critical. And in fact, there are what are called net neutrality purists, or the proponents of net neutrality, those who argue for net neutrality. They've come up with a phrase that all bits are created equal, and which means that all internet traffic must be treated equally, and service quality will be under these circumstances, obviously, service quality will be at best effort. So packets can move across, yes, from ISP to the user, from the user to the ISP to the IXP to the internet, to the international information highway freely without prioritization. So this principle accords even new companies and innovators the same permission, the same rights. In fact, they do not need permission actually to market, or even they do not need market power. They need not have market power. They need not ask for permission to innovate on the internet. So, and also finally, for regulators, what is also important is that the company that connects you to the internet does not get to control what you do on it. So these are some of the things which I just wanted to highlight from the regulators' point of view concerning the principles of net neutrality. And the core principles, let me just quickly add the issue of free choice, no discrimination, in that all data is treated equally, and that there be transparency, and that there be information. So those are generally the core principles in most of the jurisdictions. Thank you, Madam Chair, for now.
Thank you, Antony, and we'll come back to you to get your views on an African position. Janvier, what would you say about net neutrality?
Okay, thank you. Merci.
The microphone close. Please, the microphone.
Microphone.
Merci donc, Madame la Présidente, de me passer la parole.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson, for giving me the floor. Let me quickly talk about this issue, neutrality of the internet and its implication. This is what we have, but the other two speakers, the colleagues, have gone over the first point. So let me go straight to the third point regarding the African context. Fundamentally, I'm not going to go over the definitions where this was done by the colleagues. Now, the issue on the continent, how can we look into this issue of neutrality? Basically, the way our networks function, can we talk of neutrality of the internet in Africa? I'm looking at from a technical point of view. Let's note in the first place that on the continent, we have a problem of access. Therefore, we don't have all the access. It is the first problem. So all people don't have access to internet. That's the first problem. The second one is the providers on the continent, the ones who are giving us internet services. When you look at the way most of the countries, the internet is configured, or the way services are offered to the users, you would note that there are limitations. The providers, this could be deliberately or for other reasons, they offer limited internet access to the users. How does it happen? Is that in the configuration of the internet, that is what we call the net system. And this allows us to give to the users access. For instance, within this room, it is this mechanism which allows everybody to have access to the internet. But this one is really limited, because when they give you such access, and of this system, you don't have direct access to the internet. You don't have internet totally in your hands. The provider gives you simply a bit of the internet. You can only surf and load, but you cannot have the configuration which you have elsewhere on the continent. So you find the users are limited when it comes to surfing, and they're limited in when it comes to loading. They cannot develop their own content because they don't have direct access to the internet. So this is a limitation in regard to configuration, technically speaking. So such practice leads to a situation where the African users were simply there to load and simply suffers, if we may put it that way. However, what's the problem? The problem is that from the beginning, the net system was put in place because the IP addresses were being exhausted, but the problem no longer holds today. We have ISP, where you can have a blog, you can have different accounts and have a direct connection to the internet. So it is an issue today to have the operators on the continent who come back and revise the way the internet has to be configured so that each one has got direct access to the internet. The problem of accounts of addresses is no longer there. If we, in Afrinic, we were some other addresses which are available, the IPs which are addresses which are available. Now the quality of the services offered by our providers is not really good, but we are satisfied with the bad quality of the services that is provided by our service providers. Deliberately, they can limit us when it comes to interconnection, as I've explained. They may limit such access with this kind of configuration. Finally, the service provider gives you limited access to the internet. This is why we said right from the beginning that when it comes to terms of net neutrality, on the African continent, there is already a problem right from the configuration of the internet in regard. Some statistics when it comes to technical, now the numbers of addresses that are operational on the continent, the IPV. Look at the Northern Africa. We have about 31 million of addresses IPv4. Southern Africa, we have about 30 million. Eastern Africa, that is Kenya, Tanzania, and other countries, we have 6 million. Indian Ocean, those are islands, Mauritius and others, they have 5 million, and Western Africa, 3 million. Central Africa, they have not even come to 1 million. This is in terms of used addresses, IP. This is simply use, which could be abusive of the net by the operators of the countries which have marked in red. This is sort of abusing the net. When you look at fundamentally, these numbers do not represent the number of users connected, because people are connected, and if you have a university which have 20 million, which have only one address, because they want the net system, and all the children behind us, so the students cannot develop anything. When you look at the history of Facebook, there is a lot of limit. There is no access. It's access where they can only surf and use the Facebook, so they cannot develop their own content. If we could give the internet with each student with an address, they would be in position to develop their content and have their blog and so on. So that would be total access to the internet. Now, IPv6, you see where we are. I'm speaking and I control the lady who's here from Africa IGF. So in principle, they can give us, we have Afrinic, they can give us this which is unlimited for everybody. There we have 500, that is the total of the address IPv6 per region. So we end by noting that we have to continue to work on the continent so that we have open internet, neutral internet, and the service providers, they have to be vehicles. The ones who pass on information and data to the final user. Furthermore, here we could have a recommendation regarding this. The ISPs, they should stop use of NAT in Africa. In Europe, if you go to Shall Go Europe, and you have your iPhone, you can have an address which is public. You can be 4 or 5, and there is a problem of security which is resolved. But here we have NAT. Knowing certain things, I can do certain things. And also I could even attack, but I wouldn't be identified as the attacker using certain means. And because of the way we have it, we only have a single address which is public and which gives us access to the internet, so I can do what I want. So we recommend that the ISPs open internet, and they will not have a problem of addresses, and they could distribute them to the users and have connection, full connection to the end users. It should be a recommendation regarding this matter. Furthermore, the internet, which we see in the African continent, we should have access to water, as well as access to water, which is a right, a basic right to man. So the access to internet should be considered as a basic right for the human being. Thank you. I've finished. Merci, Madam Moderator.
Thank you, Janvier. Janvier has answered the question which we were all grappling with yesterday, the day before yesterday, internet access as a basic human right, so it's done. So let's just kind of recap in terms of where we're at. So Pria gave us a definition of net neutrality, but framed it in the context that we have to look at it in terms of the digital economy. We have to look at what the digital economy entails and what then net neutrality must provide us in that space. Antony talked from a regulator's perspective and gave the view that as a regulator, he is there to protect us as consumers, but he's also there to make sure that the playing field is level and that there is no discrimination in terms of access to services. Janvier has emphatically told us that at the technical level, there is no net neutrality in Africa. Please hold on to that thought, and maybe we can also debate that when we get to the discussion session. But I think he's raised a very interesting angle as well in terms of the way that we're using our IP addresses, the way that our ISPs are using IP addresses. And he's brought in an interesting aspect that says that perhaps we need to revisit the framework surrounding how IP addresses are provided to the end users, not to the ISPs. There's nothing wrong in terms of how the ISPs are getting access to the IP addresses. It is how the ISPs are then providing service to the end user. And the key concern is that as a user, I am limited in terms of the policies of my ISP and how they do network address translation, which means that the ISP buys one IP address and uses that to provision service maybe to 1,000 or more of us. And because of that, the kind of service that I can enjoy on the network is somewhat compromised. And that's the viewpoint that's coming down. And I think that's what it was about. So, questions, yes, we will take questions, but not now. We need to finish. I just want to get through two other aspects in terms of this discussion. The first one is that we've talked about net neutrality, what it is, what it might not be, and what we want from it. So I would like Pria now to just look at the regulatory implications and the legal implications. What does it mean then when we say we want net neutrality from a legal and regulatory perspective? Pria.
Thank you very much. I think from everyone's submission so far, we can see that the issue of regulating operators is certainly on the table. How we regulate ISPs is definitely a consideration. And then how we regulate content and application service providers who are also part of those innovative business deals that are starting to make us nervous is also going to be a consideration. So how is it currently done? We know that telecommunications legislation extensively regulates telecommunication operators, and it specifies a number of things in terms of quality of service, obligations for universal access, and so on. Generally, what we see is that ISPs are self-regulated. They're usually governed by codes of conduct, and the local legislation might provide for limitation of liability for ISPs based on the fact that they're mere conduits of information. We also know that there's contracts between ISPs and telecommunication operators. There's contracts between content providers, application service providers, and telecom operators. We also have competition law. We also have contracts or terms and conditions with people like Facebook and Google and certain ISP providers. So there's that bunch of regulation that we need to look at and see where might the gaps be. We spoke a lot about the regulatory priorities, and I think all the speakers so far have endorsed the need for, preventing unnecessary blocking, paid prioritization, treating traffic equally. And so I think there are a few things to keep in mind as we regulate, and then a few questions to take to the national country, at the national country level. First of all, when we think about regulating it, we must know that a neutral internet does not equate to universal internet access. So they can't be equated, and they can't be looked at in terms of regulatory frameworks in that way. The neutral internet concept is also not equal internet access. We know that different business models are going to present unequal internet access, and that's competition, and that's how it works. And when we regulate, we can't stifle innovation unnecessarily. We can't stifle competition unnecessarily. Subsidization is also not always problematic. At the AfriSig school, there was debate amongst the participants around an offer from Wikipedia Zero, for instance, for Wikipedia content versus access to Facebook for free, and that the principles and the riding regulation would be quite different. Also, what we know is that making assumptions about users' preferences if something is offered for free is also problematic. What we know for many people who subscribe to satellite TV is that just because we have free, standard government-issued TV doesn't mean that that's our preference. And so even when we regulate, we should know that people are willing to pay for better services. So what are some of the questions at the national level? How do we regulate ISPs? Is there enough liability for ISPs? We thought about them as mere conduits, and we thought about them as having no way of understanding what kind of content or controlling the content that users get. And that's the premise on which we gave them limitation of liability. Has that changed? Do they now control what it is we see? And does that limitation of liability need to change? How do we regulate these over the top service providers, so to speak, the content providers, the application service providers? Many of them are international, so they bypass local regulation. They're not subject to ISP rules. They are not subject to telecommunications regulations. So how are we going to regulate them if we are at all? And at the same time, are we going to introduce any liability for them? Do they need to fall within the regulatory structures? In terms of something that's been called for quite a bit by civil society organizations is transparency. We want to know about those business arrangements and what it entails for the users' access to services. So if there's been a deal made between an operator and a content provider about certain prioritization around certain quality of service, we want to know the details of that deal. Users should be aware of the nature of that transaction. We should be aware of how adequate our competition law is to restrict any anti-competitive effects. Do we need to introduce any changes to our competition law? We also need to understand how adequate our consumer protection laws might be to deal with issues such as quality of service and non-discrimination. In a number of countries, we have consumer protection laws, and it speaks about non-discrimination between consumers. So is it adequate, or do we need changes there? And then we also need to speak about how we take internet rights and freedoms, the freedom of choice we spoke about, access to knowledge and so on, and how do we translate that into meaningful rights that are available through legislation in the national context. We need to have a look at surveillance laws, who can monitor content and make certain distinctions between content that should be blocked and so on. And of course, we need to assess the adequacy of data protection laws. Are users given meaningful control over how their data is used by the various service providers? So that, to me, is a kind of place card of some of the issues that we need to do. And of course, at the regional level, we need to develop very firm policy positions, in principle policy positions on net neutrality.
Thank you, Pria. That provides a very nice segue into my next question, which is for Antony, to just kind of start to tickle our brains in terms of the question of Africa having a position on net neutrality. Antony.
Thank you very much, Towela. We have heard quite a lot about the technical situation in Africa concerning internet and net neutrality. And on a pedestrian level, I just want to quickly also highlight some of the issues that we see in Africa, where the networks are typically congested. We have seen low service quality and evidence of low investment levels in the networks. And there is definitely a need for prioritization of traffic. There is consideration in Africa maybe to develop the network using such facilities available as universal service funds to eliminate structural bottlenecks which indeed inherent in our networks. So you find a network comes from a point where it's coming from a switch, it's going to it's fiber, then again you find you go to copper. So that capacity which you have got in is useless in that case if you are going to have such inconsistencies in your network. And internet traffic, carrying voice conversation over IP, like VoIP, and such VoIP products as Skype, should have a priority over traffic carrying, let's say, simple mail, since we can hear delays in a Skype voice call, Skype call chat, but we won't notice minor delays in email exchange. So we definitely need to prioritize in Africa. The need for traffic management is particularly important, especially of a special type, not just simple throttling, but you must have principles which are sound for managing that traffic. The bandwidth, there's a yawning gap between what the users need by way of bandwidth in terms of the applications, the services that they require, and the amount of bandwidth that is available. So if users are to enjoy all the modern facilities, voice, Skype, Google Hangout, teleconferencing, and they are to play online games, watch TV shows, enjoy movies in high definition quality, and video on demand, services like Hulu, Netflix. It is important that we have that traffic management, even here in Africa. We hear, of course, that yes, the principle of network neutrality is the in thing. It must happen. Well, our telcos have, and ISPs have challenged this. I worked for a long time in a carrier, the telco. The argument was, if we disallow traffic management, arguing that it is only users who should have equal access to internet services, but not internet traffic. We argued successfully. We argued that with our regulator at the time, that we must allow traffic management. We cannot treat all content equally. Every packet that goes through that net, we cannot treat it equally. We argued because we said at least the users are the ones that should have equal access. Because you can't have both video and email, like I said, having the same treatment. So for Africa, I would go along with a proposal that has come up for a business tier and an economic tier. Well, we can argue about that until they come home, whether it is necessary to have a business class and the economy class, because I think a business tier would be necessary, at least for those special services which require a certain quality of service guarantee beyond the best effort offering, which is offered under network neutrality. So you find you don't have to pay that cost, but you need to get that service. Let's say if you are in the emergency services, medical, in the hospital institutions and so on, at least you must be able to have that service. That's what we feel. So as an African position, I would summarize by saying, if it is the word network neutrality which we want, if we are interested in the word, just the word, let's have it modified. Like we have guided democracy, let's have guided network neutrality. And however, it should have policy clarity and regulatory certainty in various aspects which are particularly of special interest to our citizens. And we can say, yes, it's nice to have when our networks are up and running and they are robust. It's a nice to have, but for now, I don't think it's a must have for Africa. And so network neutrality for Africa, it is, I don't think something which we are ready for, because it is good to have users, packets just going through freely and not controlled. But really, Africa has so many basic needs to solve. As Africa, besides the connectivity issues where we have infrastructure problems, where we've got access issues, which have already been alluded to, where we have goals to actually access more people. If you look at the GSMA report, they say ours is the fastest growing region in terms of mobile growth of new connections in the whole world. So all the other areas are more or less saturated, but ours is the fastest growing region. So it means it will translate to mobile, broadband, and all those others. So we have connectivity issues. We have got serious issues like to solve, like food security, water, energy, low productivity, health, education. Yes, let's prioritize those, but we can solve them faster if we use now ICTs. Let's now use the ICTs to solve all those problems. With e-agriculture, let us be more productive in our agriculture. E-education, let us be more effectively educated to solve the problems that Africa has. So it's not really a question of prioritizing network neutrality, Madam Chair. So whatever decision Africa takes, I will say in the final analysis, we must do our business case and our impact assessments finally, whatever we decide on. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. So, questions and comments from the floor. I see James. I see the gentleman in the back there and the other gentleman in the back there and Tijani. So James, sorry, Tijani had his hand up first. So can I do Tijani, James, and then that gentleman, and then I'll come to you after that.
Thank you, Towela. I have two questions. One comment and perhaps one question. For me, the net cannot be neutral since the provider of services is using your data, is using your privacy. You don't have any privacy with them. They use everything. So we cannot speak about net neutrality in this situation. This is one of the main issue of the net neutrality for me. Second point about what Janvier said about the NAT. The NAT is a very bad habit, not habit, but a very bad use of a technology that was necessary for certain circumstances. And when you are using internet under a NAT, you don't have IP address at all. You think you have an IP address, but you have one IP address for several people. Means that you don't have anything, more or less, except you can navigate. I think that if we continue, and you said it is because there is a problem of exhaustion of the IPv4. It is not the case at all, since in Africa we still have IPv4. So it was a problem of economic use of the internet. ISPs don't want to buy more blocks of IP. They use what they have and they distribute them through the NATs, and they earn more money. That's all. So I think that there is a problem of ethics that has to be addressed. And it's true that from the technical side of the net neutrality, it is a big problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Tijani, for those comments. Jimson.
Thank you very much. This is Jameson Ulufuye, Afecta. I would like to really commend the panelists. They've done justice to this topic. Appreciate the exposition and insights. Just to add a little more to the discussion, just as Tijani said, truly we cannot really be talking about net neutrality because it's business issue, as has been highlighted. So there are different model, different consideration, and we must not stifle innovation. If you look, for example, in Africa, most of the telco or ISP infrastructure, they are funded by this organization. So we don't have legacy infrastructure like maybe in North America or Europe, whereby you can say, okay, the platform is there, let it be evenly used by all. So they have to invest, and they have their business model, and they need to reap from their investment. So the case now is for us in Africa to create more awareness. In fact, it's Africa we need more user awareness. There are a lot of things users can make demand for. If I were to ask how many people read the agreement, if you want to join Facebook, join Twitter, how many people read before they say, I agree? So that is a major issue. We need to be aware of this issue. And in business, there is no agreement. We don't have any agreement on net neutrality because it's an issue of model, no consensus whatsoever. So there may be need for prioritization, and there might be need for us to provide equal platform, but it depends on the package. Package that may be made available to the user. So the user needs to be empowered. In Africa, as Antony has said, we need to get the people to be fully aware of the issue. And the ISPs, we need to make demand of them to have this IP. If you don't make demand, they'll continue with the business as usual. So the onus is on us for us to put awareness on the table. When you talk of net neutrality, we should not have a definite position on it. It's a question of business model, and we should enlighten more people. Thank you very much.
Sir, in the back.
Thank you. My name is Moses Winy from Uganda. For me, I still do not see in specific terms the strategic direction to which we are really heading forward to in terms of this discussion, because I don't understand if it is a question of the regulatory issues, policies being undertaken by national governments or the global ICT body. Because if you look, for instance, the issue of the zero-rated services, you don't want to have a scenario where the big companies, the big multinational companies are dominating the space, and the end users, for the case of zero-rated services, are having restriction in terms of preferences of what they post online, in terms of the kind of content that they consume. So even for the case of Africa, I believe that we shouldn't really be so much in that kind of desperate situation. I know we want access, but what is the value of that access when you have restriction on what space you are going and the kind of content that you are consuming? So I want to see from the panelists, where are we taking this discussion to? Who is the one in charge? Who should be able to control this? I understand the issues of net, and I'm really proposing that there should be an open net. But where is this discussion going? Is it national? For the case of the zero-rated services, who is supposed to control that? Because as you can see, as you guys have eloquently stated, I believe that is more prudent for us to have an open and free and democratic digital space where everybody enjoys, whether big and small, without any kind of differences or inequalities existing. Thank you.
Thank you, Moses. Last one in the back.
I support what was said by Antony and also what was said by Janvier. With regards to net neutrality, I believe that Africa needs to study this particular issue. In this regard, I think it would be good for the African Union and the ECA put forward proposals to organize an African forum on net neutrality so that Africa can speak the same language. And with regards to what was said by Janvier regarding net neutrality, he is right. This is a very serious issue. And I'm wondering how far we're going to go with being able to resolve this issue of net neutrality. Thank you very much.
Okay, I have two very eager hands here, so I'll take the two very eager hands and then I'll ask the panel to respond. Avis and then whichever. Yeah, I'll start with Avis and then the next one.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, moderator. I am Visumini from Cameroon. I'm an internet user and an activist for open access and effective access. We listened to the presentation by Jimson on connectivity, and we have a certain amount of responsibility. Gabon talked about the government's expectations, and this morning with the presentation on neutrality and the presentation by Janvier, I see that this is a major problem, and I'm wondering whether the recommendations made by Janvier to operators wouldn't rather be an issue of ICTs and that it should be addressed to our regulators rather, because this is my question. Would it be useful just to have access for the sake of it? I think we need to look at the various tools in order to ensure that the regulators play their role when it comes to the operators. Otherwise, you'll find that the operators will focus upon their own profiteering and not look at the wealth of Africa. Thank you.
Okay, merci.
Thank you, moderator. We would like to thank you for the quality of the presentations. The question of neutrality is of major concern in my country, Gabon. I am Menge, a member of the IGF Bureau in Gabon. In our activities, we have come across a number of operators, ISPs, who have caused a lot of problems to us, which we consider to be quite serious. In Africa, almost everyone connected to the internet do so via the mobile phones and mobile systems. And the information that they can access on mobile phones often affects the quality of the content. And today, the information that you can access on mobile phones includes Facebook, Twitter, and we have seen how our children are using their mobile phones in order to do searches and consult the various sites. So the issue of neutrality is an issue, and you can see that technology has a major influence upon the internet. And I think this issue needs to be taken into account when we are having our different discussions. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. So I note that most of those were comments and quite a few recommendations, which we will take note of. But there are two questions that I have picked out that perhaps the panel can respond to. The one is talking about whose responsibility is it and at what level? Who is it that's going to make this decision about net neutrality and at what level? Are we talking at the national level, at regional level, at continental level? That's the first question. The second question concerns the way that we manage our ISPs and those who provide us with internet services and this practice of network address translation. Is this an issue for regulation? So maybe, Antony, you can speak to that in terms of whether the ISPs can be regulated in terms of how they provide service, and then the broader question of whose responsibility is it to address this issue of net neutrality. So I'll start. You go first.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just before I answer that one, I think I'll quickly touch on the first one, the first question, which was concerning the issues that have been raised, issues pertaining to the operations of ISPs who are probably shortchanging users, and at what level should we look at these issues as we discuss. I think the level is just right from the national ISPs, national IGFs, let them discuss these issues, since the national IGFs as well have got the multi-stakeholderism. So all the stakeholders should take part. So it is right from the national, and it translates into the regional IGFs, which should resonate very well with whatever is going to be discussed at the continental IGFs, and there must be coordination, obviously, at continental level. Then the other issue that you asked was concerning the ISPs. I think it was concerning the policies, is it? Yeah, the strategic policies and issues of access and regulating the issues of zero-rated services and evaluation of the value of the access, as well as making sure that the policies and so on are clear. Well, yes, the issue of ISPs, I think definitely it has been highlighted that there is need for regulation. So I concur, really. I am also of the same view that regulation has to be effective. Only that currently we are of the view that we don't regulate for the sake of regulation. But if it's coming from the stakeholders like now, we definitely look at it. But unfortunately, you find in every jurisdiction, you don't just come up with regulations, dump sack. You must do a regulatory impact assessment, justify whatever regulatory moves you want to make. So at least it has been highlighted. I think we'll also take it up with the fora of the regulators, and also even the capacity building exercises for regulators, because we are always building their capacity. Because a regulator that is uninformed, that is ignorant of what is happening, is a dangerous one. He will stifle the sector or even destroy the sector that is supposed to regulate. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Antony. Janvier, do you have any comments?
Should a restrictive rule or a type of content one must access to. So this is the role of the civil society at the national level, I think. Another thing is that we should have a new generation of lower internet governance issue and net neutrality. That new generation of lawyers should be trained to understand the topic, to be aware of what net neutrality is, and then to be able to advocate users, internet users. So this is what I can add as comment. Thank you, moderator.
Thank you. Before I take the response from Pria, which will be the last word before we close, there is a question from remote participation, so we'll take that now.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. We have two questions from Seun, who wants to know, just give me a second. Okay, Seun wants to know if there is a need, is there a need for policy that mandates certain visibility requirements of ISP? Perhaps that will further discourage NAT and promote IPv6 deployment, including IPv4. And he also wants to know how is government and other sectors encouraging participation of their sectors in the regional internet registry policy development processes, How many regulators participate in those processes? Okay, that's it. Those are the two questions. The others are just comments.
Thank you very much. Those are noted. I'm going to ask Pria to respond to the issues about the regulation and issues about where, at what level these things should be done. And then we'll close. And as we close, I will try to attempt to answer the remote participants' questions.
I have two very brief comments. The first one is that I'm sure we can see that there's a global narrative, there's a global sort of imperative that is emerging around making decisions around net neutrality and how we approach it. But at the same time, there's definitely regional and national imperatives. It's definitely time to understand what the implications might be for us. The challenge that we face at the moment, as was very evident from the African School for Internet Governance, is that if one does research this topic and try to look at what the regulatory options might be, you are confronted with examples from the Netherlands, from the UK, from the US, and these are not contextualized in an African context. They are not contextualized in a developing country context. And so what we desperately need is analysis that will inform our future actions. It was raised that we need regulatory impact assessments, and I would add to that shopping list definitely some analysis of net neutrality in the African context, and probably some capacity building as well. And I suppose those are my two comments. Just that there is a regional and national imperative at the regional level to develop a position, at the national level to be able to assess the adequacy of the regulatory environment to deal with those multiple concerns. And then at the same time, we do need that level of analysis that's going to aid our future efforts.
Okay, so we are running out of time, so I'm going to be summarizing and closing, but I'm also going to answer or try to answer the questions from the remote participants. I think in terms of the issue of the ISPs, that has been noted as a concern. And I think in the recommendations, we are going to make a recommendation that there needs to be further examination of the practices of ISPs and whether we can get policy, legal, regulatory recourse in terms of addressing the practice of network address translation, which impacts negatively on end users. With regard to government and regulators' participation in policy development processes, my quick answer, and Afrinic will indulge me here, is that Afrinic and other institutions are very committed to getting governments to participate in these kinds of processes. Afrinic has a government working group, which is supposed to meet every time there's an Afrinic meeting. There's also space for an Afrinic government working group meeting, which is meant to engage with Afrinic on issues of how Afrinic is conducting its work, as well as its policy development processes. So I think it reflects back in terms of, for us as stakeholders, how we can agitate for our governments to be more active and to be more proactive in how they participate in some of these processes. So we are slightly behind time and I need to close. So in terms of recommendations, I think what I have seen is that one is this whole issue of the policy, legal and regulatory framework that governs how our ISPs operate. That needs to be further looked at. The second one concerns the fact that we need a further dialogue and a more structured dialogue around net neutrality, convened preferably at the level of the African Union, so that we can begin to unpack net neutrality further and look at it from an African context and not copy and paste from what is out there. The other recommendation, I think, has to do with general consumer awareness, that we need to focus our efforts in terms of making our consumers more aware when they procure services online, what are their rights and how do they actually enforce those rights from their service providers. And I think in principle, we have said that for Africa, the question of net neutrality is still an open one. Business is not ready yet to accept net neutrality because of the state of affairs of our network and infrastructure and our business models, and that we do need to have further engagement. With that, I want to thank my panelists very much for their insightful contributions. I want to thank you, the audience, also for your engagement. And I think it's time for tea.
Thank you, Towela and the panel. Great job. Just allow me to acknowledge the presence of our